I'm going to try and elaborate on these disconnects, and I'm going to build on what the minister said earlier, that there is this knowing-doing gap. So I'm going to try and define for you and also put in perspective how resilience provides a mechanism whereby we can actually understand why it is that we didn't succeed. Many of the things that you hear about, the levels of malnutrition, levels of poverty, they have remained constant and stagnant and have grown worse over time despite this huge knowledge base. So part of my life now is devoted to trying to connect these disconnects, and one of the very important aspects of this conference is this strong support from the rural support networks. I think Rashid Bajwa should be here somewhere. He's sitting over there. Mr. Shoaib Sultan, who represents the rural support networks of Pakistan, that the NRSP is one of these agents, was a very strong motivator in organizing this conference. He has to be away, but we will hear from him later. So I'm just trying to set a perspective on this. You've all heard about the ministers elaborated in great detail. We are beset by shocks. There is an energy crisis which is full-blown. There's a debt crisis which is burgeoning. We try and hide the numbers. There is a water crisis that is large and looming that we should be aware of and that we are not. And then there is poor governance. There is a decayed public service delivery system. We have to accept this. There is inadequate policy analysis. Unfortunately, monitoring and evaluation are totally absent in Pakistan. And learning from the past, learning from what we have already achieved. We go for the latest available fad, and in most cases don't realize the incentives behind that particular fad. There is an increasing reliance on donors, and the donors do not have this perspective. They are well-meaning. They bring large resources to bear. They want to help us, but it is for Pakistan to realize how to interact with these donors. We don't even have that knowledge base, unfortunately, because each time we start afresh. And there is a huge disconnect, and I will try and identify that disconnect for you. There is this pattern of dharnas that is ongoing right now. The minister shot out of here because he now has to go and placate some dharna somewhere. His real job is to be here, to be part of this debate, to listen, and to be able to convert this to policy, but most of his time is spent firefighting. And that is the unfortunate reality of my country for the past, I've been, as you mentioned, 40 years. I started at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics 40 years ago. There is a huge, there are several crises that are out of control. I mean, you have this war on terror, there is domestic terrorism, there is a pattern of earthquakes and floods and droughts and what have you. But then there are also these inherent inequalities in the system. There is an inequitable distribution of resources, and especially land, which also gets translated into power. And power then determines the types of policies that are implemented. And the louder a person can speak or more powerful that person is, that particular type of policy gets precedence, it gets evoked, and all the analysis that you can do gets lost in the process. And unfortunately, the incentives, and that's part of this disconnect, because if you don't realize the incentives under which different systems operate and within them different people, it's very difficult to understand why things that seem very logical, things that have been analyzed and produced, are not implemented. So for Pakistanis, and especially young Pakistanis, and in this audience for the scientists and the communities, the NGOs, and the people that represent academia You are influential thought makers, and you can transfer some of this thinking to the young people in the universities, because we are leaving them, unfortunately, with a Pakistan that is not equipped to handle these shocks over a longer period of time. We are hugely resilient people, and I will explain why that is so. But we have this rapidly growing population. He explained, the minister explained, that they're predominantly young people. They have very few marketable skills. Why is it that we can't develop this huge service sector? Because our young people are not trained. For them, the achievement of education is a paper that will get them a government job, and at the age of 21 they want to think about retirement benefits, and the fact that they have achieved the job means that they are entitled to a salary, and that is the mindset. And unfortunately, that is a huge, a much larger wall against which we struggle. So we have very serious underlying causes and shocks that go beyond just the shocks that you hear about in the translation of these things. This is a standard social risk a matrix that was developed at IFPRI in the 80s when I was there. And it basically categorizes all the micro, meso, and macro risks that an individual or a society can face. And it is absolutely incredible. So it goes the range from natural to health to life to social, economic, political, and environmental. Pakistan today faces 90% of these risks. Pakistanis, you go across the board and then look on the macro side. You've got earthquakes, floods, droughts, wind, you've got civil strife, you've got war, social upheaval. This was developed as a generic matrix to analyze situations globally, not for Pakistan, but we can tick off nearly every element in this. And there's huge issues in terms of this output collapse, balance of payments. There's a financial, technological, trade-induced issues, etc. Most importantly, political backsliding on social programs and political backsliding on policy, and that is part of the inherent weakness in our system that we need to address. So I want to now put this in the context of food security, which is what we're here to talk about, and I'm going to link that to agriculture and then talk very quickly about the new resilience agenda. All of you know that food security comprises 4 essential elements. It's about availability, it's about accessibility, it's about utilization, and then it is about sustainability. And you look at each element. In availability, you've got production. In terms of food, you've got production, then you have imports, exports, stocks, etc. These in turn determine your incomes also, the incomes of the people. And I will show you the characteristics of our agriculture to show you why there is such a low productivity and why these incomes are low and stagnant. But for food security, and this is susceptible to shocks. All the risks that I mentioned earlier, weather-related, the natural ones, the political ones, the personal ones, the lack of skills, etc. Then there is accessibility. And accessibility is about prices and about incomes. And again, both are interrelated, and they are reflected, for example, in the money metric measures of poverty. And for Pakistan, while there is a huge debate, and I've been fighting from one side, there is a continuing pattern of increasing money metric poverty, despite the fudging of the numbers. Then there is utilization, and that concerns consumption, and it also concerns this entire water, nutrition, the awareness about sanitation, proper feeding practices, etc., and a whole set of social sector issues that support it, that determine nutritional status. And as the Director USAID mentioned, levels of malnutrition in Pakistan are alarming. And this is the most direct measure of the welfare of your economy. You can forget about, if you want to debate the fact that these money metric measures are correct or not correct or what have you, you go and measure a child. And you measure that same child over time. And you compare that with previous. This is a direct measure. Those levels are rising. They were already very high, and that is an alarming situation. And then there is sustainability, and also a nutritional status deals with food safety issues, which is another huge problem in Pakistan. That we have a separate component in the PSSP that's focused on the nutrition studies. There's a large number of young people here working with me. Food safety issues are huge in Pakistan. Even if you can tick off that, we have all this dairy consumption, the quality of the milk that is being consumed is very, very questionable. No standards, no quality control, no regulation. Huge disconnect between the stated regulation and the actual implementation. And coming to sustainability, and this is where resilience, sustainability cross-cuts those three elements. And it is the essential element of resilience. Now, FAO has this very nice schematic, and I was mentioning to the FAO rep earlier, and I have put this up. It basically puts the four essential things that determine the resilience of a household at a particular time, and deals with the access to income and food, with the adaptive capacity, with the access to basic services. It deals essentially with the asset base and with the social safety nets that are present. And then you put a series of shocks on it, and the status of that household changes. And how resilient it is in terms of the difference between that time T0 and the time T1 basically determines that capacity. Pakistan has been mentioned before. IFPRI does this Global Hunger Index, and the index for 2014. By the way, this is built on measures of undernutrition, child underweight, and child mortality. Very simple. And it has these different ranges. So a value from 10 to 19.9 is considered serious for a country. From 20 and above is considered alarming. Pakistan is borderline alarming in 2014. It's at 19.1. So we have a very real situation now, and it is hidden, as the Director USAID mentioned. So, and all of this is linked to agriculture. And I want to basically very quickly set the stage by describing some of the characteristics of our agriculture and some of the aspects that are probably understood but ignored in the policy making and in the way in which we address some of these issues. So all of you know that the percentage of agriculture in GDP is declining. This is a natural process of structural transformation. The other sectors increase, agriculture goes down. It's been happening in Pakistan. But the percentage share in terms of the growth rate of agriculture that's coming from is also very low, and that also is declining over time. And very interestingly, we are a 4-crop agriculture. The important crops dominate, and their share remains constant, and it's growing at these very slow rates. The yield per hectare of major crops are low, not only by international standards, but by our own best farmer levels, and way lower than those determined by the work that Dr. Iftikhar's institution does. The only exception, by the way, is maize. And that's a very interesting story, because it came from outside of the normal system. This huge growth in maize, and we can talk about why it happened, and there are lessons to learn from there. The sad part of this whole story is that while the share of agriculture value added is declining, the share of labor in agriculture is not declining at that rate. You're down to 20% or 21% of value added from agriculture, and 44% of your labor force is still. So it means it's hugely low productivity. But why don't they leave? We know the answers. He knows the answers. They have community organizations sitting in every village in this country. And yet, our policies do not take explicit cognizance of this particular aspect. Then there is another very, very alarming aspect, and this is something that people miss. Compare the data that comes from the agriculture censuses of this country. In 1960, according to the agriculture census, under 5-acre farms accounted for 19%. 19% of the total, 1960 census. In 2010, they account for 64.7%. This is a hard fact of Pakistan. And by the way, when it says under 5, the average is 2.2. But that's also not, there are huge variations, and that's the second part that we forget. And this is also a huge disconnect. Our policies are made for the large farmers. You subsidize wheat because you say you're subsidizing the rural sector of Pakistan, and yet it is known that only 26% of the wheat producers in this country are net sellers. The rest consume. So you double the price, you're doubling the, and if he is a net consumer, you've made him worse off without taking explicit cognizance of remedial measures. And this is the kind of awareness that needs to be built up. So why is it that those, because those 26.2% of whatever are those farmers that sit where policy is decided, and this is their way of taking rent. For the science community and for all of us, the big question in Pakistan, and this is again also a comparison over time, there is a limited diversification in agriculture. USAID has spent enormous resources and it is still focused on increasing value-added agriculture. And it's the type of agriculture that will increase, hopefully it is the type of agriculture that will increase the incomes and the profitability of those 64.7%. And hopefully it's not the type of agriculture that subsidizes that top 0.5% who has a 5,000 head of cattle farm. But that is the focus of our needs. This diversification is limited because it is policy induced also. It is also because of a disconnect. And there are ways in which this can be addressed. But the other thing our policy ignores, and this is also very sad, that there is a large variability across regions. Pakistan is a huge and very diverse country. And if you look at the large variability in yields for these different crops, you realize how these agroclimatic zones are dispersed and where what. So one policy fits all doesn't apply across regions. You cannot have pan-territorial pricing when you know that there are these huge disparities. You cannot assess the well-being of Pakistanis from Islamabad because you have Thar and Mithi and Chachar and what's happening there with these children dying every day. And the interesting thing is that the young people of Pakistan are now realizing this. We did a seminar in the University of Sargodha, and these girls at the back got up, and because I was making a plea by saying that it is time that we took matters in our own hands. It is not for us to keep relying on governments and these other institutions because they have failed. And these girls got up and said, what can we do for these children in Thar? And I was so moved by that social. These are not the fashionable social media. These are the young people from the heart of Pakistan. They bleed for the other. But there is a disconnect. and they don't know what to do. So there are several NGOs and other agencies that are working there that these young people could have been involved in, and that's part of the things that we're trying to now build. I'm honored that Dr. Zafar Altaf is here. He's one of my, and Zafar Saab, thank you. Why are we so resilient despite this? You know, the minister said we are a great resilient nation. I think there are three factors. One, thousands of years of slavery. It has taught us to accept whatever we can get, and we never change that mindset. And then our religion teaches us sabr and shukr. Two essential articles of our faith are that you accept and you give thanks for whatever your state is. But we forget the other lessons of Islam, and the other lessons are that it's also, you have to assure as an individual that there is a system of adl and insaf. And for those that don't understand, equity and justice and access to justice. And that is reflected in price mechanisms and in these other things, and also in the price distortions that are policy induced. Voice. And we also forget this basic injunction that you have to seek knowledge and work hard for the social good, because the private good is totally dependent on the social good. We are totally short-sighted. My colleagues and I went to a very elitist boarding school in this city, in Lahore. Unfortunately, my classmates now run this country. Unfortunately, that is not Pakistan, because the social good or the social objective function is totally lost in the private, which is why there is this other disconnect. So basically a resilient system, from what we've learned at IFPRI during these international conferences, etc., it targets the weakest nodes and individuals. It's a system approach. So you basically, it is also a people-centered approach. It is based on the people. They have to define what their needs are. They have knowledge. We need to access that and improve it and catalyze it in ways that we can support it. That is the quickest way of building their resilience. And access to research and information and knowledge and the type of science that Dr. Iftikhar is doing here feeds directly into that. We need to have much better processes for that. We need to strengthen, for example, these nutrition surveillance networks. In the traditional system in Pakistan, we have joint families. There was a grandmother or two always in the house. They could spot early onset of malnutrition in the child. They had traditional wisdom that told them how to address this. That system is now broken. The young wife who is not educated, has no ways of accessing information, is focused totally on whatever hearsay. And in another seminar, and this is for another, I will talk about the very skewed consumption patterns of Pakistan, where the bulk of our intake is coming either from wheat or oils or sugar. All the dark leaf green vegetables and the pulses and those things have diminished over time. And in addition, that traditional wisdom has vanished also, so nutrition becomes a huge problem. And this capacity building has to take place at the individual, at the community, and at the system level, which is why this partnership with these networks, the rural support networks and these other NGOs, and with concerned individuals becomes so important. There are people that have given their entire lives to trying to better the communities and have done so silently. There is a lady sitting at the back there, Helga Ahmed. I honor you, madam. She is the proudest example of Pakistan. 57 years, she married a Pakistani, came here and spent her entire life working in these remote areas, totally devoted to environmental causes, etc. But at a small scale, she needs to be linked up to these larger networks. She needs to be linked and supported. These are the role models that this country needs. These knowledge gaps, there are huge disconnects. And this, by the way, is also global. How individual, household, community, country, institutions, both formal and informal, become more resilient. Why is it that one community is more resilient to another? We need to understand that. We need to learn from that, and we need to adapt it. And then how can these economic growth policies help pull these people out? That trickle-down effect that we've all heard about works if the market is working properly. But unfortunately in Pakistan, these markets do not function. I have a book on rural credit written 20 years ago on why that rural financial market was not functioning in Pakistan and why it was such a serious impediment despite the huge subsidies. All of this is known, but the disconnects between voice and translation into policy is because of the failure of a political system. It returns the same people again and again, and it does so because, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have been beaten down by centuries of slavery. It's time now for educated young and old people to come together and say, what can we do for ourselves? Ask not what this government can do for you. So we have serious questions. And then the biggest disconnect are these silos. There are silos between humanitarian agencies and development actors, even on the international arena. And remember, as I talked about incentives earlier, they have to report to their bosses. So they want exclusivity. This is my domain. I used to run the evaluation office for the World Bank. Several African countries, donors would fight over sectors. Education is my priority because I can then show directly attribution. But if it gets, sort of collaborative, then I cannot separate out. This does not mean that donors are bad, by the way. I'm just trying to tell you to understand the incentive structures and to be able to work with them. And then within the system, within our national system, how do we align these different incentives? And the key players within each. Unfortunately, in our country, it's not about systems, it's largely about the guy at the head. And if he, and in many situations, you find totally unreasonable people that have no linkage to rationality or science or whatever, have been placed in a position where they become, and there's no accountability. The largest audit office in this country is run by, it's a similar situation, you should read the newspaper. And yet, so the systems need to develop, and that is for Pakistanis to do. And that is where the scientists and the community leaders and these people, they need to come together to develop this culture of learning and then being able to adapt and improve. So the resilience agenda for Pakistan, you put communities and people in the center. You listen and learn from local language. And you build on that. You cannot superimpose a system that is not connected to the realities. You need to integrate and make these systems demand-driven. We did the evaluation of the PARC. It was funded by USAID. The basic objective was, how can we make this research more demand-driven so that it directly responds, and there is now a business plan and a plan of action to move that research in that direction. You need to connect these disconnects, because agriculture growth for Pakistan is essential, not just for the direct health and nutrition aspects, but also for rural development. Because in this environment, the commodity production and the processing, the value addition, is what is going to generate the employments for those 44% that are sitting in this suboptimal condition. So focusing on resilience from that aspect, and in the deliberations today, the idea is to bring different players with different expertise to talk in an absolutely open environment, and we will try and put this together in the form of a paper that has doable actions, and we will present it to the minister, and then we will see, we will wait for his response. Saqib, Assalamu alaikum. So basically it's a systems approach to thinking about development. This is the new development agenda of 2015, by the way, and we need to all work together to bring about this resilience, and this involving the poor and vulnerable people. That's where you start from, the farmers, the policymakers, the NGOs, the private sector, and so on. All of you need to work together. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Also, most of you know my teacher, Dr. Safraz Qureshi, is not well. I would like you to please pray for him. He's been in coma now for 9 days. Thank you very much.